A kind day to you all. I'm Kinsmarck, and it's Super Bowl Sunday, so you know what that means? Cloverfield! Because apparently the third movie in that series just came out after the Super Bowl concluded, since apparently the viral marketing campaign trend continues for the Cloverfield franchise. And I couldn't care less about football. I just have actually adored this series, or at least I should clarify, the first film in the series, because I actually haven't seen The Cellar. I'm sorry, 10 Cloverfield Lane, because that's not a real Cloverfield movie. Sorry, shots fired straight away. I'm already making people angry in the comments. And so I just checked it out. The third film called The Cloverfield Paradox. It came out on Netflix, and I figured I'd conduct another after-action review to sort of give my thoughts about it immediately after the fact, because it just aired about 3 hours ago, so I'm among the first people to ever see it live, and so clarification for anyone that hasn't seen the first experiment in this format, completely informal, unscripted, it's just my raw feelings after the fact, and this is the first one of these that I have done solo, so apologies if I get a little rambly. Anyway, concise rundown for plot. I'll have to give some spoilers to give any context to criticism or critique, or even just a condensation of the story. Suffice it to say that everything I'm about to say, aside from any vagaries that I'm sure I'll throw in, happen in the first, I'd say, 15 minutes of the movie. So all of the rest of it comes after. So anyway, to set the scene, it answers a lot of questions, in general, the film, about the Cloverfield universe. And I use that term rather literally, because I'll explain. The first premise that we get is that apparently the Cloverfield universe version of Earth is on the cusp of an extreme energy crisis. It's apparently close future sci-fi of sorts, in that there are apparently tensions that are mounting amongst several nations of Earth. I think they specifically mention Germany and Russia. Apparently Europe is just all kinds of concerned about these issues, because it seems like oil reserves are running extremely low, and there is a multinational initiative launched called the Shepherd Project that is a collider. I think it's a particle collider that is considered controversial because there are a lot of concerns about it causing essentially reality-tearing things if it fires correctly. And I can't follow the science aspect of it. I couldn't tell you how accurate or well-researched it is. Suffice it to say that in the film, at least, the premise is that if this thing comes online, it will provide infinite energy. It's essentially a zero-point generator, and it'll solve all of the crises around Earth. At least that's the idealistic image it tries to paint, because as a fan of sci-fi, I've always found that idea, it's just the next step in conflict, because humans love to fight each other, and we'll just find new ways to argue. That's neither here nor there, though. Suffice it to say, the main character, Ava Hamilton is her name, is a comms officer on this space station and has a family on Earth that she cares very much about. However, her husband talks her into going on this mission because he feels that she is capable enough to make a difference in this program succeeding. And there is a lot of cinematography in the start of the film that I can praise very highly, because it sets a lot of that scene through indirect means, just hearing things on the radio, small things that people mention. There's a lot of that in something like a game I'd call environmental storytelling, because there are more focal things going on in those scenes that one can piece elements of the contextual story together through observation of things that are just also going on. And that's common to J.J. Abrams' style. And I should also clarify, come to think of it, that he once again directed this. I think I saw his name in the credits. I'm almost certain it's director, maybe it was producer, maybe all of the above. I don't know. He's involved though. So considering the success and how much I appreciate the first film and his involvement therein, because he was focal in that film's development as well, that was, for me, seeing the credits roll for the first time, a good sign, because I didn't know if this had him involved in any way. So it is actually coming straight from Bad Robot Studios, so that too was a good thing to see. Anyway, because you can't have a story without conflict, apparently the hope that the first firing of this Shepard Collider generator thing would lead to success is a complete and total overestimation of its success. This mission that was expected to just take, I think, a few weeks, ends up taking almost 2 years. And they try many, many times and are at the real start of the momentum of the film, at the point where they have only enough fuel left in the generators, I suppose, for the collider itself for their experimental tests to do this 3 more times. And so a whole lot is riding on the critical success of this generator. And one starts to get some hints through the characters on the station seeing television interviews with authors and such that are critical of the risks that this thing carries, because it could apparently cause quantum issues. There are already fears prior to this thing lighting up that it could cause a collision of dimensions. It's apparently confronting as a story the concept of string theory and of neighboring dimensions to our own head-on. And suffice it to say, here's where the spoilers come in, if you couldn't already sort of tell because I was leading into it. They light it up and are immediately confronted with an empty porthole. Earth that was once just centered in their window is gone. And at first, honestly, I thought it was a fairly, this is where I start to get critical of the film, over-labored aspect of the first act. The conclusion of that act is them figuring out, oh, yeah, obviously this one generator in orbit on a space station didn't completely destroy the Earth because there isn't an asteroid field, there isn't debris, it's just gone. And I have to question, honestly, several things about the science in this film. First and foremost, though, why didn't they just check constellations out the window as soon as that happened to see if they are still in the same relativistic position in space? Because that's a fairly easy thing to do, and they didn't. It took them getting their systems online later to finally find Earth, because of course it still exists, on the other side of the sun, apparently, even though some sort of wormhole was torn open as someone feared in reality, and it catapulted the space station across the solar system. It's still in our system, though. However, this next aspect that is core really to the story took them, again, I think, far too long, especially as scientists that are learned in quantum physics, since this is a rather, as complex as it is, a fundamental aspect of quantum anything. The fact that they were not just sent across space and even necessarily time, they were sent across dimensions. Essentially, the crew and the entire space station of the Shepard was sent into a neighboring dimension where apparently for more than a year the resource war has already started on Earth, and there are multiple other differences, some that are more central to character arcs and their development that I won't go into for spoilerific reasons. Suffice it to say, they finally figure out, I think too late in the movie, that this is the case, and so the crew's focus then shifts to whether they can, and then later should, try to fire up the Shepard again after making changes to the equations and to the hardware, such that through quantum entanglement, which is how they're trying to say that if they activate it again, they won't just get sent to another dimension, and that they will instead return to their own. And if you're not familiar with quantum entanglement, I am not a physicist, I just know roughly what it means, so I can't give you a detailed answer. The layman's explanation is quantum entanglement is the... man, I can't even really start to explain it. I understand how it functions in context. It's like a molecular spatial... It's a physics-oriented link, almost like a wormhole, from one thing to another, such that data transmission and even theoretically matter transmission can happen instantaneously, regardless of any concerns for speed of a relativistic nature. It's not necessarily moving through space, it's circumventing it. That's how quantum entanglement, that is in the real world, conceptualized for communicative purposes, functions as we currently understand it. Because I try to keep up with these things, even though I'm not a math guy, because it fascinates me. I have a deep and abiding appreciation for sci-fi, and I'm curious to see how that technology is actually going to progress for us in the real world in the future, the near future even. Anyway, suffice it to say, the conflict then complicates. This is, I'd say, at about almost the halfway point of the film. So, mild spoiler that it isn't actually all that important. They find out that, yes, things are different in this neighboring universe that they've apparently moved to. And of course on Earth, actual Earth, well, I should say our Earth, well, even that's not entirely accurate. The original Earth that these crew members left in their version of the universe, everyone on the ground is freaking out, including the poor main character's husband, who just hears from a friend that, yeah, we lost contact with the station completely, it isn't even there anymore. And so, anyway, in this new dimension, this is where I get really critical. Clearly things are different. Even the rules of science and physics are different. And that's acceptable. However, I think the film relies upon that aspect of its story as a cop-out for a lot of things, because it isn't consistent. Things happen, and I'll cite, for anyone that has seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. What happens to, God, I can't remember his name, one of the engineers on the crew, a Scottish guy, I think his name starts with an M. Essentially, he has a thing happen to him that doesn't happen again later, even though circumstances that led to it happening the first time are, as far as I can tell, identical. Consistency of causality doesn't seem to come into play, and I know one can just say, oh, well, it's another universe, so causality functions differently. It ain't enough, I'm sorry to say, because things still exist. If the rules of physics were that different, Earth and society as we understand it, and as these characters would would recognize as at least comparable, just different to their own, that wouldn't exist. If physics were this different, as this film seems to want to say that they are in this neighboring universe, it would make for an unrecognizable universe. These fundamental shifts in causality, in physics, in molecular, like magnetism and such. And there's almost a sentience to part of it that I can't explain, and the film also doesn't explain, as far as I can tell, to some of the phenomena that happen to the crew aboard the Shepherd station, because some of it does seem targeted at the insecurities of certain crew members, and one could make the argument that yes, these members are just reacting to the things that of course they are most prone to react about. It doesn't come across that way though, and I think it's that consistency issue that got to me the most as far as a critical aspect of it. There's also a segment, as any film set, or story really, set in space, of course has to have a spacewalk whose physics make no sense. Again, I know, neighboring universe, physics aren't necessarily going to make the same sense, except yes, they do. Because we see other things happen as they should if gravity still functions the way that we understand it, and then other things just selectively don't. And like, for instance, I'll speak vaguely. Characters who are clearly under the influence of gravity in a zero-G environment. And it's not centrifugal force spinning them around simulating gravity. That's not what's going on in this scene. They're hanging from just something, a piece of equipment in zero-G, and it's not like they're just kind of guiding themselves along with it. No, the force of gravity is clearly acting on them, and they're having to exert themselves against it, and even let go of it, and then drop to another surface. I know it's nitpicking, and I know it's not the focus of the film, It took me out of it, though, for a good, I'd say, 10 minutes where several things like that happen at once. For instance, there is a part at which, to speak vaguely about it, an object is released from the spinning module, I guess you'd call it, of a certain part of the space station. And the character that is on the other side of a porthole watching it, we see the camera essentially looking at them through this porthole, and you can see the reflection of the object that is moving away from them stay centered in the frame. Except, think about this spatially for a second. If they are on a module that is spinning, and something is then released, it's going to move in a straight line away from where it was, and that module is going to continue spinning. So as soon as it leaves the space station, it's not going to stay centered in the porthole. It's going to drift off to one side because you're turning away from it because you're in a spinning module. That doesn't happen. So there's a lot of weird little spatial inconsistencies. And just to clarify, mind you, the camera does then change to an establishing wide shot that is shot from the exterior of the space station, and yeah, it's traveling the way that it's supposed to. The module is spinning, so it's, I think, just an oversight in the cinematography. And that's sad to see coming from Abrams, because he was so careful in the cinematography of the first film, and so much was told through it, indirectly and in little hidden corners. And there are a lot of Easter eggs for fans of the franchise. There's a little Slusho bobblehead sitting on someone's desk. There's I forget the name of the company exactly. Tagrauto, I think, is the name of it. That I think is a heavy manufacturing company that apparently made some of the modules for the space station, so you can see their logo on things. So it does tie a lot of things together, and I think that was the purpose of this film in general, was to tie a lot of the questions surrounding the universe together and to answer how these weird things happened, because the discovery is made rather early on. However, it isn't focused upon that the Cloverfield monster, apparently monsters plural, came from the rift that was apparently torn in dimensions when the Shepherd fired and overloaded the first time. Well, not the first time, sorry. The third from the last time, the time that it caused all of this. So that is when apparently the creatures fell from orbit and caused all the havoc. Now, the question that I have about that is, and I'd have to check the timestamps, essentially, is that I'd say main Easter egg of the first Cloverfield film is that days prior to the New York incident, let's say, one can see from over the shoulder of one of the characters in the found footage segment an object, presumably the Cloverfield monster, falling from orbit into the sea at, I think, Long Island or something like that. Maybe they were at another area. Essentially, just near the coast, on the east coast of the U.S. I suppose one could make the case that that wasn't necessarily the creature. However, as immediately as these things started to cause destruction in the Cloverfield paradox, it seems as though the timelines don't match up, because it seemed as though in the first film that the thing arrived and then a considerable amount of time passed and then it came out of the sea and started causing destruction and havoc. That's not what we see here, unless for some reason the first movie is set after this one, and so that was just a small one. However, I'd then have to ask, why didn't the characters in the first film recognize it? Because these monsters have apparently ravaged the Earth prior to that, if that timeline arrangement is correct. So it answers, I'd unfortunately say, about as many questions as it raises about the first film in particular and the franchise narrative as a whole. I won't give away the ending, I'll just say that I was a little underwhelmed with it, especially the scene that immediately precedes the cut to credits. That felt a little ham-fisted and forced, like a, yeah, right, we get it. It was just like, see, this is Cloverfield, and I'll leave it at that. I know the question that everyone is going to ask, and I should also clarify if I haven't made it clear indirectly already, this film isn't a found footage style like the first. It's shot conventionally, albeit well, from a cinematographic, if that's the term, perspective. It is a well-shot film and does play with expectations. For instance, the camera will do that close-up and then swing to something so you expect a jump scare that doesn't come, and then gives it to you later. That happens fairly frequently, so this is a film that'll keep you on your toes. The question that I know everyone's going to want to ask is, does this film show the monster or monsters? And the answer is, sadly, almost no. One can catch a glimpse of its shadow through some dust at night from a ruined hospital for about 10 seconds of screen time, and you can hear it making noise in the distance, and that's about it. And it does get shot clearly at one other point near the climax of the film, and if you've seen it, you know what I'm referring to. I've already indirectly referenced it once, and that's it. So if anyone is actually approaching this expecting a monster movie, you're sadly going to find yourself severely disappointed. The one other aspect of this film that I will praise it for is that it doesn't... It doesn't. I'm confusing myself here. I'll just say what I'm thinking, because, again, I immediately started this after the credits rolled and I finished the film. So, in some aspects, it doesn't labor overlong on set-piece occurrences, things that would freak characters out, that would cause an extreme reaction, and that one could essentially just spend screen time on them reacting to and the aftermath. It doesn't really do that. It'll show you, thing happens, characters are concerned, and then cut to like half an hour later, and they're all sitting around a table talking about, okay, what are we going to do about this? And I actually can appreciate that, because you get the point. Things happen, and instead of just everybody just, oh no, concern, fear, scared, that, yeah, we know characters are going to react that way. We don't need to see all that. So the film doesn't show us all that. It shows us them trying to figure out how it's happening, how they can fix it, etc. after the fact. And so therefore makes, I'd say, semi-efficient use of its screen time. I do think some of the mysteries that J.J. Abrams is so fond of centering around on his films did take a little too long for the characters to realize the effects of. I understand actually putting yourself in the scenario of coming to the actionable conclusion, I have changed universes. This isn't the Earthiverse that I know, and so I have to just accept that and actually start changing my course of action accordingly. That, I realize, I get, is a heavy and very hard realization to internalize. I get that. It, again, though, coming from a crew of cosmonauts, NASA astronauts, and I can't remember the term for Chinese astronauts, apologies there, a multinational crew of scientists, of professionals, of people who are clearly versed because of the functionality of this collider generator thing in quantum physics, that just don't think of the explanations that are clearly staring them in the face for most of this movie. I'll say there are a few fake-outs, story-wise. Only one is, I'd say, predictable. Unfortunately, it's a critical... I can't even really call it a twist, because I saw it coming from a mile away. Maybe some of you won't. I don't know. To the conclusion of the film. It's just one of those like, yeah, okay, all right, I expected that to happen. So it doesn't really just come at you. I will say, though, that the emotional aspect that I won't give away details of, um, core to the main character, Ava Hamilton's character, is very well handled. It is labored a little lengthily in a few places. However, it shows you what you need to see, and if you're an at all empathetic person, I think you can definitely feel where she's coming from in her conflict about some of these things. She's presented with a very personal moral dilemma that I could hardly even imagine putting myself through, and it doesn't necessarily force a resolution to that dilemma immediately. It actually gives the character time to come to a an emotional and as well as a logically reasoned conclusion, and to then act upon it. And I like that about it. I think that's about all I have to say. I'd say, as far as other aspects that I haven't commented all that much upon, the soundtrack was alright. It was complementary to the mood. It definitely gave you that heart-pounding kind of feeling, the jitters during the tense scenes, and especially near the start, had an almost like flowery sort of sense about it. In a few places, almost felt like the soundtrack to a fantasy movie. That was a little strange, albeit fitting in a weird sort of way. The character that I'll say, as central as he is to some of the storylines and the character development of the main character, unfortunately doesn't really contribute much to the overall film except to just remind you of his existence, is the main character, Ava's husband on Earth, who like goes to help folks at a ruined structure, I'll say. And we check in on him from scene to scene every now and again and see how he's doing and how he's freaking out about hearing that his wife just disappeared in orbit, and how he's helping to save a little girl, and we don't really like get anything out of that. That story arc doesn't really go anywhere. It just sort of happens, and I'm like, all right, this feels like a strange use of screen time. So I'm conflicted in that I feel like in certain aspects the film is efficient in its use of time, and then in others it isn't. So it's almost as though there were competing ideas about how to structure and to pace the storytelling of the film. The casting, I'll say, was spot on. I can't really fault anyone on the cast for shoddy acting. It was all pretty strong. The the characters that I appreciate the most are some of the side characters, actually, because they actually do seem, aside from the lack of questioning things and figuring things out like I think they should have, in other aspects, though, in general, their personalities do seem like the level sort that astronauts generally are, because they're screened for that, because you don't send unstable or unpredictable personalities into a condensed little space up in space for months and apparently years at a time if you haven't checked to make sure that they aren't going to go crazy up there because of issues that arise. So they have to react well under pressure, and there are a few cracks. However, again, considering the circumstances, I'll cut the film a little slack in that the characters do crack occasionally. What we have seen in the real world of astronauts keeping it together is fairly tame compared to the circumstances that the characters in this film are put through. Because astronauts that we're aware of, yeah, I mean, they're doing important things. They're conducting experiments that could help life on Earth, maybe. It's very incremental. It isn't immediately demanding. The literal fate of the world doesn't depend on them doing what they were sent there to do. So I could certainly see how, even with the usual character and psychological screenings that are subjected upon astronauts and the like, that one would still see some cracks and some character failures, considering the incredibly heavy circumstances that they're put in. To a certain extent, I recognize that's sort of a cop-out. And one character in particular, I'll even name him, Volkov. He seems a little jumpy for an astronaut. cosmonaut, I suppose, because he has a, I don't know, is he a Russian guy? I mean, his name is Slavic. Maybe he's Ukrainian or something. I don't know. That guy, though, he just, he's the only one of the crew that I don't think comes across the way that one would expect a person that is intended to serve in that capacity would. Now, I'll say, though, that the film sort of leads you to make certain assumptions about him and multiple other characters that it'll then play with. Some of your suspicions will pan out. Some will not. At least that's the way that it was for me. So it's a film that keeps you guessing, because it'll engage in cliches every now and again, and then it'll seem like it's setting up a cliche and then do something else with it. So that was interesting. I did like that. Aside from that, I think that's pretty much all I've got. There wasn't all that much, as far as I could tell, which may perhaps indicate something good, in the way of CGI. I think most of this was shot on sets and sound stages, and so therefore it was mostly practical effects, and that I think did the film some favors. There are a few instances, I'd say I could count them on one hand, in which the CGI is obvious, and unfortunately it's that immediately credits prior scene is one of them. I really wish they'd spent just a little extra time and money on that one little 5 seconds of screen time, because anyway. Aside from all that, though, I am of generally positive, albeit mixed, feeling toward the film. Because there were oversights. I think the thing that irked me the most about it, to just conclude things, is in fact the inconsistencies of causality. Because I think that defenders of this film who really enjoyed it will lean on that a great deal and say that, well, of course things are inconsistent. Of course things aren't going as expected, because it's a different universe, it's different rules. And I think one could only in good faith lean upon that excuse so hard for so long until it gives out and it's just like, nah, that's just an excuse for inconsistent storytelling. Especially when one can cite in the film circumstances identical from one to another, from scene to scene, that pan out differently from time to time. And all right, one... God, I want to say one... It isn't a scene, it's just a strange side plot that doesn't really go anywhere of the film. It happens late enough, though, and it caught me off guard enough, though, that I'd almost hate to compromise that and to spoil that for anyone seeing it for the first time. The film does have a mild sense of humor about itself, and the side plot, I'll put it this way, surrounding the character of the Scottish guy whose name I can't remember, is one of the most amusing in a comedic sense, and it does give that film a little touch of lightness so that it isn't completely taking itself 113% seriously all the time, in a way that I appreciate. And there is some gallows humor going on with that character, and honestly I think he was written most accurately as an astronaut, him and the commander for the entire crew, out of the entire cast. I think they are the most accurate to the astronaut archetype, I suppose, in that cool under pressure, handling things and getting a little ruffled when things go wrong, however staying very objectively focused and accepting that there are risks involved in some of the things that they have to do, and I appreciate that about it. So it seems as though there was mostly enough research done to give the film an air of credibility. There are just a few points where it falls short in that realm. However, they aren't necessarily critical to the core narrative. So that's... I think I've said this 3 times now. I'm just really trying to comb through my recollection of the film to see if I did miss anything. I think that is indeed all I have to say for now. So I'll wrap this here, and I'll just ask that the comments give me some feedback. One, did you see this film? What did you think of it? Do you agree or disagree with any of the things that I have said? And comment as well about this format. I recognize that it is very informal and that not everyone is going to enjoy it because it's just me sitting here talking. There isn't anything adjoining it. I might have in post slapped a poster or something up here to at least frame this contextually as far as the topic I'm talking about. That's it though, and it's really just me talking to you. And I know some people adore that kind of format, some people hate it, others are just like, eh. So where do you fall? I'd like to take a measure of this channel's audience and see how it's received from there. So I'd say if you have Netflix, because again, this is where it came out, check the film out, because it is worth watching. And I'd say, at my most cynical, come at it with middling expectations and let it surprise you. Because it will, I think. Just don't expect it, unfortunately, to live up to the original if you hold that on any sort of pedestal. I think that's about as concisely as I can put it. So, thank you all kindly for watching. If you have enjoyed this, let me know, and I'll see if I can come up with other films, series, maybe even games, to do this sort of after-action review for in the future. And also, if you have enjoyed this channel's content at all, because I know we actually have a lot of new people actually lately, since we have had a fair amount of channel growth, for which I am very grateful, consider checking out our Patreon to help us keep the show alive. I'm Kinsmarck here at Last Level Press, and as always, I wish you all good gaming. Well, good, wham. This isn't a gaming thing. I'll come up with the first part of that for the next one of these. And Godspeed.